Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. It's already 12:20. My presentation today is on Robert Rules of Order and consensus decision making for non-profit organizations. Um, I think just to recap for today's workshop, what we are really trying to achieve is actually to talk about governance. It doesn't matter whether you are NGOs or government departments or private businesses. All these 8 aspects of governance is applicable. Accountability, transparency, being responsive, being equitable, being efficient, follow the rule of law, whether it's participatory approach, and if the decisions are made on a consensus-oriented basis. So when we talk about good governance, we are really actually talking about the process of decision making. And for my presentation, I'm going to focus on consensus development, consensus decision making, and how we can use Robert Rules of Order as a tool or as a element that can be applied by organizations in Malaysia. So, of course, we are very familiar with the 4 basic styles of decision making. This is a Dilbert strip. Uh, I think cultural reasons for our country and also organizational culture, it is very common to have top-down meeting sessions where the boss will make all sorts of remarks and there won't be much feedback. But really, the dynamics of a group or team is actually about uh, partnership and collaborative efforts, more so for NGOs. So maybe in a traditional business company or whatsoever, it could be more unilateral or directive, meaning that the boss or the leader will decide and everybody will just implement and execute it. But in some situations, it could be consultative, as in the decision is still with the leader, but they ping off ideas with the team members and see what the feedback is like. And then we have the less common approach, a democratic approach, in a sense that the majority will decide regardless of the status. And the last but not least is a consensus model where you might not get everything you want, the majority might not get everything they want, but we're trying to accommodate everyone's interests with a compromise decision in the end. So this is the 4 basic styles of decision making that happens all the time. And I'm not saying it's always directive or it is always consensus, but this is really dependent on 4 factors, I would like to say. The first factor is always information. We have to make decisions based on correct data and timely information. So there are 2 issues here affecting decision making. One is uncertainty, meaning that sometimes you do not have enough info to decide. And sometimes, although the info is there, it's too complex for us to arrive at a optimal decision. And then, of course, in any meeting, in any human interaction, we have interpersonal issues. We have some people who are more dominant in personality. We also have people who are more experienced, perhaps. Then they have more contribution to the discussions. But this is actually how decisions can be arrived in a group. When can we make sure that everyone participate and not the same people who's more aggressive or who's more dominant will get to decide the agenda and the decision. Of course, we also make decisions based on potential risks and consequences. So if we don't discuss it, we might overlook certain consequence of our decisions. We might overlook certain risks with choices that we make, and we might not fully explore the alternatives that are out there in our final decision. So that is why when we talk about the 4 basic styles of decision making, we have to understand that it is not always the same all the time. If you are making a personal decision, it would be unnecessary to talk about consensus. You only have to decide what makes you happy. But if you are deciding for something on behalf of your members or you're deciding something on behalf of someone else, you have to make sure that you have representation. You have to make sure that you have what we call proper stakeholder assessment, that their rights and their responsibilities are fully addressed. So sometimes, due to time or resource constraints, we can only make a decision under suboptimal conditions. Not enough information, not well represented, or we didn't really fully think out the consequence of our actions. So Rowe and Mason in 1987, they actually came up with a very useful construct where he called it a decision-making style inventory. They found out that some people in certain situations, they tend to be more analytical. Some people tend to appeal to social situations. So, for example, a behavioral decision maker would actually look at the atmosphere of the room. They want to keep everyone happy, so they tend to compromise. And people who are more analytical or directive tend to be more rigid, and they are more suitable for certain tasks or technical decisions. But when it comes to NGOs, we are actually trying to juggle a very different scenario. We are not talking about bottom line in total. We're not talking about dollar and cents alone, but we are also trying to arrive at decisions that everybody can accept and everybody can buy in. Because if there's no buy-in for an NGO activity, you don't get people to invest time and effort to carry them out. So this is where the Robert Rules of Order comes in. So just now, our invited speaker from GPPM was talking about annual general meetings, but it can be used for that. The Robert Rules of Order is for any meetings, but I will focus on the day-to-day operations of a organizing committee or a executive committee. And we do that all the time when we were undergraduate students or when we come up with these professional associations. You know, the standard office bearers must know their roles and their responsibilities. So when we set out an agenda, the Robert Rules has spelled out that, you know, we always have this sequence of task in a meeting where we do a call to order, see who is present, check the last minutes, and then we go through the reports, and then we decide on important issues, unfinished business, or any new business. But these are just the what we call steps that we take in a structured meeting so that we do not miss out on the decisions. But how do we decide on the process of taking everyone's input into consideration during a meeting? And that is where the Robert Rules of Order provide a framework or what we call a structure for you to interrupt, to ask for clarification, to choose to vote for a certain decision during a meeting. So we do this all the time, but we vaguely follow the Robert Rules of Order in many of our NGOs. In countries like Europe and US especially, they actually embed the Robert Rules of Order as their constitutional clause in carrying out their activities. We do not do that actually. There's pro and cons to it, which we will elaborate further. So this is a cheat sheet. When we say it's a cheat sheet, meaning that you don't have to go and read the whole Robert Rules of Order. There's about 400 pages of text. It is just important to know. You don't even have to follow whatever that's on the screen at the moment. You only have to know that every meeting, when you want to make a proposition, they are called motions. And we just say that if I want to make a motion, I would just say I propose to move a motion. I would like to suggest a motion. But the idea here is that there are procedures and processes that you have to follow. If we are discussing a motion and you are trying to add in elements, you can't do that just by simply suggesting it. So this is a very what we call an artificial approach to meetings, but they are very useful in situations like annual general meetings where it is more formalized, so that people don't just simply interrupt. That is why before you attend an annual general meeting, your associations will usually require you to submit a motion that you would like to propose, right? So that is the reason why we see that you have to submit your motions upfront so that that can be put in the agenda. So what we want to do here is actually to suggest that the Robert Rules of Order is not exactly very suitable for non-profits because it is unnecessarily cumbersome. It's a little bit complex. And in any case, the highest authority of any registered NGO is its charter, which is the Perlembagaan Pertubuhan, as mentioned by our JPPN speaker earlier. So always go back to your constitution. The Robert Rules of Order is just a framework. What we would like to suggest and everyone to consider is actually consensus decision making as an alternative, where it's a more inclusive approach to accommodate diverse points of view. And this is something that we do every day. Somebody provide an idea, we pass it around. Some may agree, some may disagree, some may counter with other suggestions. And if we can form a general agreement, then that's how we make a consensus decision-making process. And this has been well developed, the steps of the consensus decision-making in NGOs, in associations. One of the best examples here is actually the process. The process is actually a 5 step where you go from discussion, what are you proposing, is there consensus? If there's none, we have to revise it or we block it, meaning that we will shelve it. And if there is a acceptable consensus for everyone, then we will just take action. In fact, in some situations, especially in town hall meetings or in some NGOs overseas, they produce these flashcards, that somebody could just raise on the floor when they have a meeting, and they will know what are the concerns of the particular member attending the meeting, and to facilitate the consensus of a group during the decision-making process. So there is plenty of resources from Bresson where they can detail out exactly what you do. We don't have to go through that here, but we can always mix the two approaches. A slightly watered down element of Robert Rules of Order will be the democratic rules of order, where you vote to decide supplementary agendas, or you can have consensus voting, because for consensus building exercise, there's usually no voting involved. You want to get everyone to agree, which is quite impossible to do at times. So when we compare the Robert Rules of Order and consensus decision making, we can see there are advantages and disadvantages to the approach. The Robert Rules are very clear, and it makes the parliamentary process is very clear, and it is very efficient in reaching a decision. But the bad thing about the Robert Rules of Order is that the majority actually have a bigger say in these matters. Once they have a simple majority, they can basically push through any agenda or program. But Robert Rules of Order by itself is also subjected to higher degree of formality. If someone who's not familiar with the process, and it can be abused, there'll be points of order all the time, and the dynamics can be divisive because you have winner and losers in a motion. So technicalities of procedure is a potential barrier, and senior citizen groups, they don't really like to use the Robert Rules of Order because it's too formal, and they're afraid to speak up because they're not too sure how the procedure is like. So when we use consensus decision making, it's more inclusive of minority points of view. We can arrive at better quality decisions because we have synthesized all the different opinions and there's bigger buy-in. But it takes a longer time to reach a decision. It requires more facilitation. And this is very important. You can be frustrated just by one or two people who just want to disrupt the process and disagree. So a consensus cannot be reached. So this is where we go back to the basic idea of governance, good governance. What are we trying to do with our NGOs? What is our purpose here? And why is it important to maintain civility in the process, being professional? Is because we can disagree on any motion, we can disagree on any program to be carried out. We can agree on a program and then disagree on how to carry it out. But the idea here is that at the end of the day, we are all working for the same goals and for the same purposes. So it's very important for us to maintain civility, because while we can have arguments during meetings, once a decision is reached, we should all support it. And that is the real reason why we emphasize on this decision-making process that is more inclusive, that is more respectful, and make sure that we treat others as you would want to be treated. So I will stop and end here for the Q&A.